Good morning, Droitwich. This is Star of Bethlehem. We're looking to see if there's an astronomical candidate that could possibly explain the account in the Gospel of St. Matthew that talks about the appearance of the Star of Bethlehem during the Nativity. Not only are we thinking about the Gospel of St. Matthew, but also, very briefly, we'll think about the lyrics of a particular Christmas carol. Sing along if you like. Come on. That's enough of that. Right. Right, we're going to be looking at reminding ourselves about the account in the Gospel of St. Matthew about the Magi and the appearance of a star in the east. And we'll be asking ourselves, how many astronomical candidates do we think might conceivably have been the Star of Bethlehem? How well do they fit the idea of a particular object? How well do they fit the words of the account of St. Matthew? And we'll be thinking about the timing. If certain astronomical events did take place around about the time of the Nativity, do they fit the timeline as we understand it? And I'll be using a piece of software that will show us the sky 2,000 years ago to show us what might have happened. And then I'll summarize at the end. So let's remind ourselves what is actually in the account of St. Matthew. So the principal elements of the account, I'm going to highlight in red the 5 things that we ideally are trying to explain with the Star of Bethlehem. So the Magi journeyed to Jerusalem, and they were prompted by a star that appeared in the east. Remember, they didn't follow a star in the east. They were prompted by the appearance of a star in the east, and they went west, ultimately to Jerusalem. They asked King Herod, what's this we hear about the sky is telling us that there's the birth of the King of the Jews? How did they interpret, or why did they interpret a star appearing in the east with a sign for the birth of the King of the Jews? Having got to Jerusalem and asking King Herod, what's this we hear about this news? King Herod wasn't aware of what they were talking about. So is there a reason why King Herod, despite the Magi seeing the signs in the sky, King Herod didn't, apparently? The Magi journeyed on to Bethlehem, where the star reappeared in the sky and then stopped in the sky. So those are the 5 things that ideally we would like to take into account in an astronomical candidate. So those are the things to bear in mind. But before we spend any time thinking about the Gospel of St. Matthew, let's just return once more to the Christmas carol and just listen to the lyrics of the first verse. Enough. Right, we 3 kings of Orient are. Bear in mind, in the Gospel of St. Matthew, there is no mention of 3 people visiting the baby Jesus during the Nativity. It's always assumed that there were 3 visitors, simply because there were 3 gifts mentioned: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. So, if there were 3 gifts, it's assumed that there were 3 Magi. But actually, there could have been 20 Magi, 17 of whom are then complaining, I didn't know we were supposed to bring gifts. So there are 3 gifts, but no mention of 3 Magi. So we shouldn't really have 3 in the Christmas carol. And where do you get kings from? Kings is a recent invention. There's no mention of kings in the Bible. It's talking about Magi, the plural of magus, or wise man. The gender of the original language translation implies they were male, and it implies that they were plural, so basically wise men. But kings? No mention of kings, so we really ought not to have that in the carol either. Where did these individuals come from? No mention of geography whatsoever. They might have come from Persia. Some people believe they were Persian priests. Might have been Persia, might have been further east, might have been India, might have been Outer Mongolia, could have been almost anywhere. So there's no mention of exactly where they came from. If you regard the Orient as being the Far East, then we shouldn't really have that in there either, because there's no mention of that in the Gospel of St. Matthew. And they saw a star in the east, and they didn't follow it, they went west. So we shouldn't have that either. Was that a question at the back there?
No, it's just feeling how temperature.
Oh, I thought you were waving at me or something. Okay, so according to the Gospel of St. Matthew, we ought not to talk about three, we ought not to talk about kings, we ought not to talk about the Orient, and we ought not to talk about following yonder star. So you can see the Christmas carol is rapidly falling to pieces. And I'm a physicist, I'm a scientist, I like precision, I like accuracy. So I think we ought to rewrite the Christmas carol with the correct words in place. So it ought to be something more like, rather than we three kings of Orient are, it ought to be we indeterminate number of men of unspecified geographic origin are who saw a star. Now you can see why physicists don't write Christmas carols. I admit the top one is inaccurate, but at least it meters nicely, and it's a good sing-song. And bear in mind, whenever we talk about the three wise men, we should remind ourselves we don't know there were three wise men. We should talk about the n wise men, where n is some number greater than 1 and less than infinity. It's greater than 1 because we know the original translation implied plural magi, plural of magus. Okay, so let's return to the idea of what a star could be, what the star could be. One thing we have to bear in mind is a star, as used in centuries and millennia past, does not mean the same as the star that we think about today. We think of a star now as being a large ball of gas with gravity holding it together and nuclear reactions at the core producing light and heat, such as in our sun, keeping the solar system warm. But star in past centuries hasn't meant that necessarily. It has simply meant something seen in the night sky, other than the moon, presumably, which has got its own label, as it were. So we should remember that star means something seen in the night sky. Sometimes we get some of those labels even coming through to the present day. But what used to be called a wandering star, remember, fixed star doesn't mean the star stays in the same place in the sky, because as the Earth turns, all of the stars seem to move. But a fixed star is one that is fixed relative to all the other stars, fixed in a pattern that we call constellations. But those dots of light that seem to move through the constellations were called wandering stars. We now call them planets. We understand what they are, and so we no longer use the idea of a wandering star, except perhaps with Lee Marvin in the occasional film. And some points of light weren't points of light. They were points of light with tails, apparently. And indeed, we now call them comets. They were called broom stars or hairy stars or tailed stars. And we have to remind ourselves that comets are very much like cats. They have tails and they're unpredictable, but we can work out where comets are in the sky, and so we can, in principle, work out were there comets around at the time of the Nativity. So that's something we can think about. So wandering stars, hairy stars, and some aspects of describing something in the sky as a star still survives today. For instance, shooting stars. We tend to call them meteors, but still in some conversation we call them shooting stars. So the idea of a small particle of dust or grain of something coming into the Earth's atmosphere, getting hot and appearing as a streak of light in the sky. So you can see star should be interpreted fairly broadly in terms of what we're trying to explain here. Basically, anything seen in the night sky. So let's not fixate on the fact that it can't be a comet because a comet isn't a star. We know that now, but let's treat it a little more liberally. Do we get any clues by looking at how the adoration of the Magi has been portrayed in past years? Of course, all of these paintings are many, many centuries after the Nativity, but it's worth having a look just to see if there's any clues in there. And the answer is basically no, because generally speaking, people paint a particular scene according to what they think the public wants to see, not according to historical accuracy. So it's always three kings that are visiting, for instance, despite the fact that there's no evidence that there were three of them. And we usually have the Star of Bethlehem in the background. This particular one was, 1624. There's the Star of Bethlehem in the background, shining its radiance down onto the baby Jesus. And that's fairly typical of most of the depictions. This is Botticelli. That's probably Botticelli himself on the right-hand side, photobombing his own painting, apparently. That's presumably the Star of Bethlehem at the top there. And there's Joseph at the back, looking very bored, not taking part in any of the celebrations. Perhaps that's appropriate, because allegedly he didn't take part in the conception either. So, and we find all sorts of depictions slightly earlier, 1423, again, presumably that's the star in the background. The star is usually shown symbolically. One exception is the painting of Giotto, in which he actually shows what is presumably the Star of Bethlehem in the background there as a comet, or a flying meatball. It's difficult to tell the difference, but presumably that's supposed to be a comet. And indeed, when a spacecraft was sent to Halley's Comet fairly recently, it was named Giotto as a homage to this particular painting, showing a comet in the background. I can only find one painting, in this case by Rubens, I can't remember the date, in which there doesn't appear to be a Star of Bethlehem in the background, despite the fact that, again, it's depicting the adoration of the Magi. No star in the background, but interestingly enough, there is a two-headed camel, which is quite interesting. So we don't get any clues, but perhaps that's not surprising, because paintings are works of art. They are not depictions. They are not documentaries of what actually happened. Now, when it comes to looking at what's going on in the sky, we have to remember that every planet, every bright star, every constellation, in particular those constellations in the zodiac, the strip of sky through which the planets appear to move, simply because all the planets are moving in essentially the same sort of plane. So all star groupings, all planets, all bright stars had an astrological significance. And remember, astrology was not only popular a couple of millennia ago, it was popular until relatively recent times. Even Newton himself earned a crust by actually doing astrological star charts for various people. So if we think about the interpretation that astrologers might have applied to objects in the sky, there are lots of ways that you can interpret the appearance of different planets in different parts of the sky. For instance, depending on which mythology you go with, Venus, or Aphrodite if you prefer, is often associated with beauty and fertility and birth. And Jupiter, or Zeus, depending again on whether you're talking Roman or Greek, is often seen as the chief god, the god of gods, if you like, the king of gods, royalty. Jupiter is associated with royalty and is considered to be, by many cultures, the king of planets. And if we look at stars themselves, Regulus is the brightest star in the constellation of Leo, and you can perhaps see from the first three letters of the word for Regulus, you can see that it's somehow associated with kingship. So sometimes Regulus, the brightest star in the constellation of Leo, is considered to be the king of stars. By no means the brightest, but somehow it's got that moniker. And the constellation of Leo itself, seen by many cultures as a lion, because it's one of the few that does look a little bit like the animal it's supposed to represent, because of the sort of mane, if you like. We'll see it a little later, the mane of the animal. Leo is associated with the land of Judea, because the land of Judea, the people of Judea, have a flag on which sits a lion. So the lion in the sky is associated with the lion on the flag, which is associated with the land or the people of Judea. So why do astrologers assign all of these things? Why do they think it's significant that this planet appears at this time in this constellation? Well, it's because it was believed that the sky is basically where you read what God has in store for mankind. If you want to know, are we going to have a good harvest this year? Are we going to have a flood? Are we going to have a famine? Are we going to have an earthquake? If you want to know what's in store, you read the sky, because that's where God tells you what he has in mind for the next few months or the next few years. In other words, the sky is effectively God's Facebook page. That's where he posts what's going to happen. So astrologers will spend their time reading the sky and then either deciding what to do next or advising whoever pays them to do the astrology, perhaps the local king, to actually watch out because we're going to have a tough year next year because there's going to be a flood or something like that. So that's something to bear in mind. So let's have a think about what we know about astronomy and astronomical things that occur in the sky and ask ourselves whether or not they meet the criteria that we're trying to address in the Gospel of St. Matthew. So we're going to consider a few possibilities and ask ourselves, for each of these possibilities, is it reasonable that this particular star will have appeared in the east? Is it reasonable that it would have been considered a significant appearance? Is it reasonable that Herod wasn't aware of what we were talking about if we interpret it and then go to see King Herod and ask him what's going on? Is it possible for this star to reappear in the sky? And is it possible for the star to stop in the sky? So we'll do that for each of these possibilities. Firstly, what about a shooting star? Could a meteor shower have been the Star of Bethlehem? Well, meteors flash all over the sky. For those of you who've seen a meteor shower, the meteor can appear almost anywhere, and so there's no reason why you would say the star appeared in the east. And they happen all the time. There are a number of meteor showers during the year, and they tend to recur year after year. So the appearance of meteors in the sky would not be in any way considered a significant event. And perhaps then it would be no surprise that Herod wouldn't know what they were talking about if somebody came along and said, I've seen a sign in the sky, because it happens all the time, so why would you interpret that with any significance? Whoops. And the meteors can indeed reappear in the sky because one shower can come and go, and then another shower can appear a few months later. But why would you ever talk about a meteor stopping in the sky? They tend to flash through the sky in a fraction of a second. What would you mean by a meteor stopping in the sky? So a few ticks and a few crosses there. What about a comet, or as the icon would indicate, the meatball? What about the appearance of a comet in the sky? Can a comet appear in the east? It could. Would it be significant? Well, if it was bright enough and had a long tail, then certainly the appearance of a comet in the sky would be considered significant. But if it was significant, why on earth would Herod be unaware of said event? Herod's eyesight wasn't actually too good, but he had a court full of astrologers, and they would have advised him if something interesting had happened in the sky. So if it was big and bright, why wouldn't Herod be aware of it? Could a comet reappear in the sky? Well, comets go around the sun. Every once in a while, a comet might disappear behind the sun and then reappear on the other side again. So yes, a comet could reappear in the sky. But comets move through the sky as they go around the sun. Why would you talk about a star stopping in the sky? It would have to be a very, very peculiar orbit for the comet in order to make it appear to stop in the sky as it was orbiting the sun. So that doesn't seem to fit either. What about a new star, a nova? Not a new star in the sense of a star that suddenly has been born, but a star that was previously invisible, temporarily gets brighter, and so becomes visible with the naked eye in the sky. If it's bright enough, well, it could certainly appear in the east. If it was bright enough, it might be considered significant. We still have that problem. If it's bright enough to be significant, why wasn't Herod aware? And reappearing in the sky, it's a question mark rather than a yes or no. Nova stars can indeed brighten for a while and then tend to dim back to their original brightness. And it is possible for a star to do that and then later get brighter again. But the period over which they brighten tends to be decades or longer, not a few months or whatever we need to account for the nativity, the timeline of the nativity. So the timeline doesn't seem to work there. And can the star stop in the sky? Well, a nova is just one star of many and is fixed in position relative to the constellations like all the other stars. So if it's fixed in position relative to all the stars, why would you ever talk about the star stopping in the sky? Doesn't seem to work. Supernova, you could argue, is a similar argument to the nova. A supernova is a star that has come to the end of its life and blown itself to pieces in a spectacular explosion, which could be quite bright, especially if the supernova is not too distant from Earth. It could appear in the east. It would definitely be significant if it was bright enough. Again, if it's bright enough, how come Herod wasn't aware of said explosion? Can the star reappear in the sky? Well, it's a general rule of thumb that once a star dies and blows itself to pieces, it doesn't tend to do it twice. Once it's dead, it's dead. There are no zombies that come back to life and then blow up a second time. So a supernova can't reappear in the sky at the same position. And again, if it's a star, regardless of how bright it is, it's fixed relative to all the other stars. Why would you talk about it stopping in the sky? It doesn't seem to fit. But there is a fifth category, a fifth star, which seems to tick most of the boxes. It's a conjunction, an alignment of planets. Planets are going around the sun all at different speeds, as we'll see in just a moment, and every once in a while planets will appear to be in the same part of the sky. So a conjunction of planets could appear in the east. Would it have been significant? Depends how you interpret it. If you're an astrologer, you might say this planet and this planet in conjunction in this constellation corresponds to this, this, and this, and then you can apply some significance to that. If you're a different astrologer, you might apply a different set of rules, as it were, and you might come to a different conclusion. So perhaps it would have been significant to some people, but perhaps not significant as far as the astrologers in Herod's court were concerned. So they didn't tell Herod about this news that they'd seen in the sky. Can it reappear? Planets go round the sun and they are always changing position, and therefore a conjunction of planets can reoccur at a later time. So yes, the star can reappear in the sky, and planets can stop in the sky. Again, I'll show that in just a second. So a conjunction of planets seems to be a contender. It seems to tick all the boxes, the 5 aspects of the Gospel of St. Matthew we're trying to deal with. Excuse me, could I just ask for a glass of water? I'm just getting a little bit croaky here. Thank you very much. Let's just make sure we understand what I'm talking about when I talk about planetary conjunctions. Hypothetically, 2 planets going around the sun. It is generally always true that the planet closer to the sun moves faster. So it's being pulled by the sun with a stronger gravitational force, and as a result it moves faster. So note that the green planet moves faster than the red one. It hasn't got as far to go, and it's moving faster. So the length of time it takes to go round the sun is much shorter. So as a consequence, different planets will appear in our sky in different places. If I just run that little animation again, sometimes those planets will be far apart in the sky. Thank you very much. Sometimes those planets will be very close in the sky. Generally speaking, they never actually sort of go past each other, just like when the moon goes round the Earth. Every once in a while it gets between us and the sun, but we don't get an eclipse every month when the moon passes between the Earth and the sun, because generally speaking the moon's orbit is slightly tilted relatively to the Earth's orbit round the sun, and so when the moon and the sun cross in the sky, they miss each other by a little bit. One goes a little bit north or south of the other. And it's actually quite rare for the moon to actually cover the sun to give us an eclipse. The same is true for planetary conjunctions. They generally will move through the sky. They might appear in the same chunk of sky, but generally they will miss each other by a fraction of a degree or maybe a few degrees as they pass each other. Another consequence of the fact that the inner planets move faster than the outer planets is that every once in a while, if we imagine that we're on the green planet and we're watching the red planet could be any planet with an orbit outside ours: Mars, Jupiter, Saturn. Because the inner planets move faster, although the planet itself is moving, let's imagine they're moving anti-clockwise, so we're looking at them from above the Earth's North Pole, although the planet will be moving anti-clockwise, moving through the sky from west to east, every once in a while, because the Earth is on the inside track and is moving faster, every once in a while, because the Earth is moving faster, the planet in the sky will appear to move backwards. In exactly the same way that if you're on a multi-lane motorway, if you're watching a car doing 60 miles an hour, but you're doing 70 miles an hour, that car will appear, according to you, to be moving backwards. So it's the same idea. So most of the time, the planet will be moving from west to east, but every once in a while the Earth overtakes it and it appears to stop in the sky, start moving backwards, stop in the sky, and then continue moving forwards again. The planet itself is just doing its own thing, happily going around the sun. But because we're overtaking it on the inside lane, temporarily, for a few months, it might appear that the planet is going backwards and then continues its forward motion again. Let's just run that again. Normally going from west to east, but every once in a while, it'll appear to stop in the sky, move backwards for a short time, stop in the sky, and then start moving forwards again. So that little dance that these outer planets do, we understand why that is because we understand orbital mechanics. Even if the orbital mechanics wasn't understood, people have known that the planets do this. They do little S's in the sky. Mars, Jupiter, Saturn do this every once in a while. So now we've got an idea of how the planets move. Let's have a think about what particular astronomical events. Let's just put conjunctions to one side just for a second and ask ourselves, was anything else going on that could conceivably have fitted the timeline? We have to start with when Christ was born, and the answer is we don't know. There's no tablet chiseled anywhere that says Christ was born in 6 BC, but we think it's probably somewhere around there. According to the calendars that we currently understand, remember, calendars have changed from the Julian calendars to the Gregorian calendars, but according to the scheme that we now have, we think Christ was born in this period. One thing to bear in mind is there was no year 0. If you count backwards from 2 AD backwards to 1 AD, backwards again, you don't get to 0, you get from 1 AD to 1 BC. That's something to bear in mind. If you're ever using an app on your phone to see what the sky looks like and you think, oh, I wonder what it was like 2,000 years ago, bear in mind that some software doesn't correctly account for the fact that there was no year 0. But we think Christ was born in this period because many people believe King Herod died in 4 BC. And for the reasons I'm sure you know from the Bible, Jesus was born before King Herod died. But many biblical scholars, I'm not a biblical scholar, I have read little bits of the English translation of the Bible, but of course that's been translated through different languages over the centuries. Some people believe that King Herod's death has been misdated. We don't, again, know when King Herod died. There's no statement that King Herod died in 4 BC for obvious reasons. All we know is King Herod died some months after this eclipse, which followed the season of the flood, which followed the Great Famine, which followed, in other words, one event is tied to a whole load of other events. And some people believe that there's been a mistranslation from the original Aramaic or whatever through to the Greek, through to the English. And that instead of talking about the last eclipse, it should be the latest eclipse of the season or something like that. And one word has been mistranslated, so the wrong eclipse has been used to date Herod's death. And some people believe that Herod died in 1 BC, in which case Christ might have been born a little bit later. This is relevant for what we're about to say. Quite why nobody believes it was 3 BC, I don't know, but there we go. There seems to be a little bit of a gap. But the basic problem is there's a lot of uncertainty as to when we should be looking for the Star of Bethlehem. Comets were around at the time. Although they're unpredictable in the sense we don't know how long their tails would be, we do know where they are. We can calculate now where comets are, and we can wind the clock back 2,000 years to say, well, that comet would have been visible in the sky at this particular time. There was a bright comet in 12 BC. We're fairly sure it's bright because it's bright now and it would have been even brighter then. This is Halley's Comet. It comes around every 76 years and we can easily calculate that it would have been around in 12 BC. But isn't that a little bit early for God to be posting on Facebook that something interesting is going to be happening in 6 years' time or 7 years' time or 8 years' time? Doesn't seem appropriate. Other comets were around in 4 BC and 5 BC. So there, the timing is much better. But these comets weren't particularly bright. One of them was Comet Holmes, which we saw a few years ago, and the outer part of the comet suddenly got a lot bigger, which was an interesting object for astrophotographers to have a crack at, but it wouldn't have been very bright back then. The second comet there in 4 BC, That's the comet Churyumov-Gerasimenko, a wonderful tongue twister. It's the one that the Rosetta spacecraft visited and put a little lander down onto the surface of the comet, little Philae lander. Again, we visited that comet. We know exactly where it is now, and we can work out exactly where it was, but it would not have been very bright. It would have been a long way from Earth and a fairly long way from the sun, and it wouldn't have been very bright. So bright enough, but too early. Right sort of timing, but not bright enough. So comets don't seem to fit the bill. What about nova? Well, the Chinese saw a new star appear in the sky in late 5 BC, and the Koreans saw a new star appear in the sky early 4 BC. Now, bright nova don't come along very often. You might only expect to get one every 100 years or so. If they're bright enough to be easily seen with the naked eye and considered significant, we're not talking about using telescopes, remember. They don't come along very often. So what's the chances that two come along like buses in very quick succession? Unlikely. It's much more likely that the timing is wrong and that the dates have been, again, mistranslated somewhere, and they actually saw the same nova somewhere towards the end of 5 BC or early 4 BC. So a nova probably did indeed appear in the sky. The Chinese say so, the Koreans say so, but remember, we're not dead keen on the idea of nova simply because it doesn't seem to fit the account of St. Matthew. If a new star appeared in the sky, why would you talk about it stopping in the sky? That doesn't seem to fit the narrative. But when we look at conjunctions, things start to get very interesting. That's the symbol, the first object there is the symbol for conjunction. So that means the conjunction of these two things, and instead of writing them in English, I'm using the astrological labeling. Curly 4 is the symbol for Jupiter, curly H is the symbol for Saturn, and the one on the end there is the symbol for Venus. So there was a conjunction between Jupiter and Saturn in about, 5 BC or so. Very similar to the conjunction we might have seen, December of 2020, the COVID year. We had a conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn in the sky. We saw them come together in December around Christmas, and that was at the time quoted that maybe that's what happened for the Star of Bethlehem. One thing to bear in mind, well, apart from the fact that it obviously fits the timeline of the conventional birth of Christ, Jupiter, generally speaking, is a very bright planet in the sky. Saturn, somewhat less. It's quite a bit less bright than Jupiter. So it would have been interesting, and indeed it was interesting, to see them come together in the sky, but it wasn't anything like the conjunction that came a few years later, the conjunction between Jupiter and Venus. Venus is essentially the brightest planet in the sky. Jupiter is a very close second. So Jupiter and Venus would have been a much more spectacular conjunction than Jupiter and Saturn. And I think it's worth having a quick look at what was going on in this conjunction. I admit that the only reason that that could be the Star of Bethlehem is if King Herod died in 1 BC rather than 4 BC. But the jury is still out on that, and I believe that biblical scholars are still arguing as to whether that's the case or not. But regardless, I think it's interesting to just look at what happened at 3 and 2 BC. So here I'm using a piece of software called Starry Night to have a look at a chunk of sky to see what's going on. I'm not showing the sky and the land and the horizon because I'm going to do a time lapse and run the clock forward, and I don't want the horizon to be jumping around all over the place. And similarly, there are planets that are going to be moving backwards and forwards as they go around the sun, and I'm not labeling them all, otherwise labels will be flying backwards and forwards and everybody will get a little bit nauseous. Okay, so I'm going to keep the gaze fixed on this particular region of the zodiac: Gemini, Cancer, Leo, Virgo, etc. There's the brightest star in Leo, Regulus. There's Lion, and the backwards question mark, the sickle, is what many people sort of relate to the head of the lion, as it were. So the Regulus there was the front paws. I have labeled Jupiter, so we've got some sort of a reference. I'm not labeling everything else. I know you can't read it, but I've set the clock to August of 3 BC. And I'm asking, what are we going to see in that chunk of sky? So let's run the clock forward for a little while and see what happens. The planets, as I say, are moving along this line, the line of the zodiac. They are generally going from west to east, which means in this view we're going from right to left. So the planets are spending most of their time moving in this direction. This is Venus behind Jupiter, and remember the inner planets move faster than the outer planets, which move much more slowly. So Jupiter is going to move to the left. Venus is also going to move to the left, but it's moving faster. So that means Venus catches up Jupiter, and at a particular point in time, Venus and Jupiter are very close in the sky. This is now August the 12th, 3 BC. Venus and Jupiter are close in the sky in the constellation of Leo. Two very bright planets getting very close together. By close, I mean separated by less than the diameter of the full moon. You can probably very easily, with your little finger, just cover up both planets at the same time, very close together in the sky. How might that be interpreted? Venus and Jupiter in the constellation of Leo. Venus signifying birth, Jupiter signifying king, Leo signifying the land of Judea. So a conjunction of planets in the constellation of Leo could be interpreted as birth, king, Jew. So maybe this is a sign from God posting on Facebook that something is going to happen about the birth of the King of the Jews. You can't tell from this diagram, but by looking at the timing and the dates, etc., this particular conjunction would have been seen as a star in the east just before sunrise. It would have been a star in the east. So a star in the east, king, birth, Jews. We've got the first two elements of the account of St. Matthew. The astrologers would have had their interest piqued. Something interesting is going to happen. We could go and talk to Herod, or we could just watch the sky for a while and see what happens. So they watched the sky for a while. Venus moves on. Jupiter now continues its motion and passes very close to Regulus, the king of stars. The king of planets has just passed the king of stars. Jupiter moves on and gets to the point where the Earth is overtaking it on the inside lane, which means Jupiter stops in the sky. The clock is still running, we're still clicking over, we're now into December. Jupiter has stopped in the sky and is now moving backwards, i.e. towards the right. What happens in the next few months? Jupiter passes Regulus a second time. The king of planets has just passed the king of stars a second time. Now that the Earth is done with its overtaking, Jupiter stops in the sky a second time and continues its forward motion and passes Regulus again. The king of planets has just passed the king of stars, not once, not twice, but 3 times over the course of a few months. Perhaps the astrologers might say to themselves, one king is either dancing around the other king or perhaps passing the crown on from one king to another king. Maybe King Herod ought to know about this. This is rather important for him. When do we go see King Herod? Well, I don't know. This is all looking very interesting, but maybe we ought to watch the sky just for a little longer and see what happens. Venus is over here now. Venus has already done one circuit of the sun. Remember, it's going around much faster. So Venus is now back again and is coming in from the right-hand side. What happens if we run the clock a little bit forward? We're now into 2 BC. Venus is in conjunction with Jupiter again. Previously, the conjunction was a very close conjunction in the sense that they were certainly in the same part of the sky but still visible as 2 dots of light. You might be able to cover them with one finger, but there were still 2 dots of light, just like we saw with Jupiter and Saturn 3 years ago. But this conjunction was spectacular in the sense that it was so close. These objects are now so close in the sky, I don't think any human would be able to resolve them as 2 points of light. They would have merged together as one very bright star in the sky. Just to show how close they came, remember no telescopes back in the day, but if we artificially say, well, what if they had a telescope, just how close together would Jupiter and Saturn have been, because you can't tell from this particular diagram, let's zoom in as if we had a telescope and see just how close they were. They were so close together that if you had a telescope, the disk of one planet would be touching the disk of the other planet. They're of course at different distances, but as seen from the Earth, they would be touching. And this field of view is much smaller than any human can perceive, can resolve. In other words, anything in that object, anything in that field of view would be seen as a single object. You would not see this as 2 points of light. So the astrologers would have seen these 2 points of light move in the sky as we approach this conjunction, and then at some point they would have seen these 2 points of light merge together as one. How often do you get a conjunction this close? Well, it's difficult to calculate precisely, but I'd be surprised if a conjunction this close happens more often than a few times every millennium. So it's almost a given that the astrologers would never have seen anything like this before. So again, we've got the same two planets, Venus and Jupiter, in the same constellation. Again, birth King Jews, now much more spectacular. This perhaps was the starting pistol that told the astrologers, you've got to go see King Herod and find out what's happening. So here's a sort of little cartoon reminder of the sequence. There was a close but not necessarily spectacular conjunction of Jupiter and Venus in the constellation of Leo, which could have been interpreted as birth of the King of the Jews. They then continued watching the sky, and the King of Stars was passed by the King of Planets not once, not twice, but 3 times over the course of the next few months. Maybe that means one king is passing over to another king. In the summer of 2 BC, Jupiter and Venus again in conjunction in Leo, but this time so close they could not be resolved as 2 points of light, a spectacular conjunction which would have been the starting pistol. They then go to King Herod, and maybe his astrologers simply didn't draw the same conclusion. Even though they saw the same conjunction, they didn't necessarily draw the same conclusion. How long did it take them to get to Jerusalem or Bethlehem? We have no idea. Remember, we don't know where they're coming from. Are they coming from right next door? Are they coming from hundreds of miles away or thousands of miles away? We don't know because the Bible doesn't tell us. Did they walk or did they come on camels? Well, if you believe the Christmas cards, they always come on camels. But there's nothing in the Bible that says the Magi arrived on camels, so we don't know. It could have taken them weeks, it could have taken them months. I suppose in principle it could have taken them years to go from the starting pistol to the actual visitation of the Nativity. There are some people who say that it wasn't the baby Jesus, it was the toddler Jesus that they actually visited. But it's interesting to note that a few months after the second conjunction, Jupiter stops in the sky one more time. On which date in December does Jupiter actually stop in the sky? It stops in the sky in 2 BC on the 25th of December. Yes, yeah. That is an entire coincidence. It's just the way it is. Because we know the Christians took over pagan festivals, Saturnalia, the celebration of the ending of the winter, the passing of the longest night, as it were. So there's no reason why it should be 25th. It's just a coincidence that that is the day that, or the night that Jupiter stops in the sky. So we know that happened. That sequence of events we know did happen. But we don't know whether or not that was necessarily the Star of Bethlehem. Maybe it was that conjunction that inspired the account. Maybe that conjunction or series of conjunctions was seen by astrologers and everybody else in the sky. Maybe the account, maybe the story was passed down from generation to generation until St. Matthew wrote the Gospel some, 150 years later or so. Maybe when the Gospel was written, the account that had been passed down through the generations, maybe that story of the conjunctions were then woven into the narrative that St. Matthew wrote for the Gospels. Maybe he didn't. Maybe it was something else. Maybe it was nothing to do with that. Maybe it was other astronomical events that actually produced the original Star of Bethlehem story. What we do know is the facts that I've been stating, the fact that particular conjunctions took place at particular times. But second-guessing the significance that an astrologer might have attached to those observations in the sky, well, we are just second-guessing. It is pure speculation as to how an astrologer might have interpreted what we know actually happened in a few years BC. But of course, regardless, the underlying message is still the same. and that is I hope you all have a very Merry Christmas. Thank you.